Shabbat Shalom. In 2008, Yahya Sinwar was being held as a prisoner in Israel when he developed a brain tumor. Israeli surgeons operated on him and successfully removed the tumor, saving his life from what would have most likely been certain death. And then, just days ago, an Israeli sniper ended his life with a bullet to the head. If you don't believe me, you can see the picture of Sinwar's corpse that's now blasted all over the internet with a huge concave in his skull. But I'll warn you, this picture is not for the faint of heart. If you were here for Sukkot services yesterday, I talked about Sinwar and what his death means for this very interesting holiday. And after services, someone was commenting to me about the picture of Sinwar's body that they saw. And he said, I wanted to look at the picture of his corpse. I had to see it. I mean, even David kept the head of Goliath, he said. I wonder if after a year of absolute trauma for the Jewish people, if many of us share the same sentiment. It's as if seeing that awful picture brings us some degree of closure. Perhaps seeing him dead brings us one step closer to this terrible war ending. After all, it was Sinwar who was the chief architect of the October 7th attacks. He was the one that promised Israel's defeat. If you look at the minutes from Hamas's meetings that leaked earlier on the press this week, Sinwar actually thought he would be able to overthrow the Jewish state completely. Apparently, God or an Israeli sniper had other plans for Sinwar. Regardless of who or what sealed his fate, he won't be overthrowing anything anytime soon. This morning we read from Parshat Ki Tisa. If I'm being honest, I didn't quite understand why we read this on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Sukkot. So I did what rabbis do when we don't understand something. I looked it up in the Gemara. So I opened up the Talmud and I found the reason in Tractate Megillah 31a. It says, quote, Rav Huna said, that Rav said, when Shabbat occurs on the intermediate days of the Chag, whether on Pesach or on Sukkot, they should read the portion of See You Should Say to Me. This is what we read, as it includes the halachot of the festivals and the intermediate days. Now the Talmud is obviously right. In chapter 34, which we read this morning of the book of Exodus, we do get a series of verses that say, quote, celebrate the festival of weeks with the first fruits of the wheat harvest, that's Shavuot, and the festival of ingathering, that is Sukkot, at the turn of the year. 3 times a year, all your men are to appear before the sovereign Adonai, the God of Israel. I will drive out nations before you and enlarge your territory, and no one will covet your land when you go up 3 times each year to appear before the Lord your God. This is what we just read this morning. Now, note for the record, Sukkot is referred to as the festival of ingathering here. I spoke last night about how Sukkot kind of goes through a bit of an evolution where it starts out more of a harvest holiday and turns into more of a hut-dwelling holiday. Now, I understand why the sages, I guess specifically Rav Huna and Rav, would ordain that we read the previous verses on Shabbat of Sukkot, but that's not all we read. We read the previous chapter from Exodus as well, chapter 33, which is radically different. This chapter discusses the anecdote of Moses asking God to reveal his face to him. If you'll recall from this story, what we just read, Moses begs God to, quote, reveal his glory to him. But God tells Moses that no one can see his face and live. So God and Moses kind of finally come to an agreement, and God places Moses on the cleft of a rock, and Moses is allowed to see God's back as he walks by. And this sight is so magnificent that Moses' face radiates afterwards. Now the question arises, why do we read this particular story on Sukkot? Like I mentioned a moment ago, I guess it makes sense that we read about the festival of ingathering, but why this narrative, this God face story? I'll tell you, dear friends, the answer to this question is not in the Talmud. I looked. Those rabbis don't have much to say about that. So this morning you'll have to hear an answer from this rabbi instead. The whole holiday of Sukkot is designed to remind us that even when life was hard for our ancestors in the wilderness, God provided them a lifeline, an umbilical, if you will, for life in the desert. Even though the places they wandered for 40 years were virtually uninhabitable, with God's help, they were able to persevere by building these Sukkot, these booths in the middle of nowhere. During these 40 years while they wandered, there was also a lot of turbulence for the Jewish people. If you'll recall, lots of stuff happens while they're in the Midbar. 12 spies come back with a bad report and the people are punished. Korach rebelled, the whole earth swallows him and his family up. Miriam conspires against her brother and is covered with scales, and she eventually dies, and on and on and on, so much more. I wonder if during Sukkot we are supposed to be reflecting the experiences that the Israelites had while wandering the desert. I wonder if we too are supposed to share in some of the trauma they experienced. Perhaps like the desire for closure to see the dead face of a man who committed so much evil. Perhaps during Sukkot we need to read about Moses' quest for closure. Someone who had endured so much, who just wanted to see the face of the divine. We're told throughout the Torah that God is the source of life and death. Is it then not ironic that the same place where God's chosen people gave Sinwar life is the same place that they later took it from him? We just stood all day long and pounded our chests, asking who will live, who will die, who by fire, who by sword. And now we daily petition God to save us. Hoshana. Sinwar's demise only serves as a greater example of what this holiday represents. The fragility of life. God can sustain us even in the desert with little resources. Or God can wipe us out, perhaps with the pull of a trigger, even when we think we are the brilliant mastermind of a supreme plan. Now, what comes next in this awful war is not up to us, and every expert seemingly has a different opinion. Perhaps this is wishful thinking, but my hope is that with the death of this tyrant, we can bring one step further to peace. My prayer for us this holiday is that while we relax in our own sukkahs at home or here at the shul, we can attempt to remember the fragility of life and reflect on all the blessings that the divine has bestowed upon us. I don't know what will happen next, but what I do know is that if we can attempt to seek the face of God, we too will radiate with his splendor. Shabbat Shalom.